Some of history's darkest experiments weren't hidden in secret laboratories. They happened in respected hospitals, government programs, and institutions where people believed they were safe. And the disturbing part isn't just what researchers did. It's how long some of these experiments continued while doctors, officials, and institutions knew exactly what was happening. Stay with me, because these first three cases are only the beginning, and the experiments ahead make medical ethics sound like something humanity invented embarrassingly late. 1. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study. In 1932, the U.S. Public Health Service began what became one of the most infamous medical studies in American history. Researchers recruited 600 black men in Macon County, Alabama. Of them, 399 had syphilis, and 201 did not. But there was one enormous problem. The men were not given informed consent and were not properly told what the researchers were really studying. Instead, they were told they were being treated for something called bad blood, a vague local expression covering several illnesses. They were offered medical examinations, meals, and even burial insurance. It sounded like healthcare. In reality, researchers wanted to observe what untreated syphilis did over time. Then the story became even darker. By the 1940s, penicillin had become the standard treatment for syphilis. Yet the men in the study were not offered that treatment. The experiment continued until 1972, when public exposure finally triggered an official review and brought it to an end. 40 years. That's not an oversight. That's an entire generation of people having enough time to ask, should we maybe stop doing this? 2. The Willowbrook hepatitis experiments. In the 1950s and 1960s, Willowbrook State School on Staten Island housed children with intellectual disabilities under conditions that were already notoriously overcrowded and troubled. Hepatitis was widespread inside the institution. Researchers wanted to understand how the disease spread and whether it could be prevented. Their solution sounds like something that should have ended the meeting immediately: deliberately infect children with hepatitis. Some children were intentionally exposed to the virus as part of experiments studying the disease and possible preventive measures. Historical accounts describe infected material being administered orally, including preparations derived from the feces of infected patients. Parents technically gave permission during parts of the research, but the consent process became one of the experiment's biggest ethical controversies. Admission to Willowbrook was extremely difficult, and participation in the hepatitis research was connected at points with access to admission, raising serious questions about whether families really had a free choice. Researchers argued that hepatitis was already so common at Willowbrook that many children would probably become infected anyway, which is an extraordinary piece of logic. The building is already on fire, so apparently bringing your own matches counts as research. 3. The hospital patients injected with cancer cells. In 1963, researchers at the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital in Brooklyn conducted an experiment that sounds almost impossible today. Chronically ill patients who did not have cancer were injected with live human cancer cells. The purpose was to study how their immune systems would respond and reject those cells. The patients, however, were not properly informed about what was being injected into their bodies, and adequate informed consent was not obtained. Some were elderly and debilitated, making the ethical problem even more serious. Researchers argued that they expected the cells to be rejected, and that explicitly mentioning cancer might unnecessarily frighten the patients. In other words, the information most likely to make someone reconsider volunteering was apparently the information they decided not to emphasize. The study also had not been presented to the hospital's research committee, and physicians responsible for some of the patients had not been properly consulted. Later review proceedings found serious professional misconduct, and that may be the most disturbing part. This wasn't medieval medicine. This was New York City in the 1960s. Color television existed. The Beatles were about to conquer America. And medicine was still learning that perhaps patients should know when somebody plans to inject them with cancer cells. 4. Guatemala's secret STD experiments. Between 1946 and 1948, American researchers working with Guatemalan officials conducted experiments that remained largely unknown for decades. Their goal was to study sexually transmitted infections and test whether penicillin could prevent them. But instead of simply observing patients who were already sick, researchers intentionally exposed people to diseases including syphilis and gonorrhea. The subjects included prisoners, soldiers, psychiatric patients, and others who often had little ability to understand or refuse what was happening. Researchers initially used infected sex workers to expose some men to disease. When that method proved unreliable, they moved to more direct methods, including applying infectious material to deliberately abraded skin and, in some experiments, inoculating subjects directly. Thousands of people were involved in the broader research program, and informed consent was not obtained in anything resembling modern ethical standards. The experiments ended in 1948, but the story remained buried until historian Susan Reverby uncovered the records decades later. In 2010, the U.S. government formally apologized. Apparently, maybe ask them first took more than 60 years to reach the meeting agenda. 5. The Monster Study. In 1939, psychologist Wendell Johnson and graduate student Mary Tudor conducted a speech experiment involving children at an orphanage in Iowa. The study later became known by a name that tells you almost everything about its reputation: the Monster Study. 22 children participated. Some already stuttered, others spoke normally. Tudor met with the children repeatedly and evaluated their speech. One group received positive encouragement, but several normally speaking children were treated very differently. Tudor criticized their speech, suggested they were beginning to stutter, and warned them to be extremely careful when speaking. Imagine being a child and having an educated adult repeatedly tell you there is something wrong with the way you talk. The experiment did not magically turn the children into lifelong stutterers, as some later retellings have exaggerated, but records indicate that some became more reluctant to speak and showed negative reactions to the criticism. The study was never published as a normal scientific paper at the time. Decades later, the University of Iowa publicly apologized for it. Science had discovered something revolutionary. Humiliating vulnerable children can, in fact, make them miserable. 6. Holmesburg Prison Experiments. For roughly 2 decades beginning in the 1950s, Philadelphia's Holmesburg Prison became an unusually convenient laboratory for medical and commercial research. Dermatologist Dr. Albert Kligman, later famous for his work involving retin A, conducted numerous experiments there using prisoners as subjects. Prisoners were exposed to substances through skin tests, including pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, and industrial chemicals. Some research also involved dioxin, the highly toxic contaminant associated with Agent Orange. The men were generally paid for participating, which made the experiments attractive in a prison environment where opportunities to earn money were extremely limited. And that creates the uncomfortable question: how voluntary is a choice when one side controls almost everything about your life and the other is offering money? Kligman later described seeing the prison population as an enormous opportunity for research. His work became part of the larger debate over whether incarcerated people could genuinely provide voluntary informed consent. Many former prisoners later said they had not fully understood the risks. The prison was supposed to contain inmates. Instead, researchers looked around and apparently saw something else: a laboratory with locked doors and an unusually large supply of test subjects. 7. Operation Whitecoat. Not every disturbing human experiment fits neatly into the same ethical category. Operation Whitecoat is a good example. From 1954 until 1973, the U.S. Army conducted biological research involving more than 2,000 Seventh-day Adventist servicemen at Fort Detrick, Maryland. Many were conscientious objectors who were willing to serve their country but refused combat roles. Instead, some volunteered for medical experiments. Participants were exposed to infectious agents associated with diseases such as Q fever and tularemia, so researchers could study infection, treatment, and prevention. Unlike many notorious experiments from the era, the volunteers went through a consent process, were allowed to discuss participation, and could refuse an individual experiment. That distinction matters enormously, but the basic scene is still remarkable. Young soldiers entered specially designed facilities knowing scientists intended to expose them to pathogens so military medicine could learn what happened next. The program contributed useful information about infectious diseases and biological defense, and many volunteers later expressed pride in participating. Still, imagine explaining your military assignment back home. "No, Mom, I'm not going overseas. The Army is giving me Q fever on purpose." History occasionally makes even voluntary paperwork sound terrifying. 8. The Fernald radioactive oatmeal experiments. In the 1940s and 1950s, boys living at the Fernald School in Massachusetts were invited to join something with the wonderfully innocent name of the Science Club. For children living inside an institution, that probably sounded like a privilege. There was one detail missing from the sales pitch. Researchers from MIT and Harvard were studying how the human body absorbed minerals. As part of the research, some boys consumed food containing small amounts of radioactive tracers, including radioactive calcium and iron. One experiment involved cereal containing radioactive material and was partly supported by the Quaker Oats Company. Parents received consent letters, but critics later argued that those letters did not clearly communicate the radioactive nature of what their children would consume. The radiation doses involved were reported to be relatively low, and this wasn't an attempt to poison children. But that doesn't erase the central ethical problem. Vulnerable, institutionalized children were used in research without the kind of transparent, informed consent expected today. Years later, former residents brought a lawsuit, eventually resulting in a multi-million-dollar settlement. Nothing ruins the wholesome image of a bowl of breakfast cereal, quite like discovering the secret ingredient was scientific tracer. 9. The Stateville malaria experiments. During World War II, malaria was devastating troops fighting in tropical regions, and American researchers desperately needed better treatments. Their solution brought them to Stateville Penitentiary in Illinois. Beginning in 1944, prisoners volunteered for experiments in which researchers deliberately infected them with malaria, often by letting infected mosquitoes bite them. Then came experimental anti-malarial drugs, whose effectiveness and sometimes toxicity was still uncertain. Thousands of inmates eventually participated in malaria research at Stateville. Some developed brutal fevers, headaches, chills, nausea, and other symptoms. Prisoners were even involved in maintaining mosquitoes, recording data, and assisting with parts of the research itself. There was a consent process, and many prisoners actively wanted to participate, particularly during the patriotic atmosphere of wartime. But historians have pointed out the obvious complication. Consent inside a prison is never quite as simple as signing a form. Participation brought money, status, privileges, and potentially favorable consideration for parole. The research produced important knowledge about malaria drugs. It also produced a question medicine still wrestles with today. When your volunteers live behind bars, exactly how free is voluntary? 10. Pregnant women were given radioactive iron. From 1945 through 1949, researchers at Vanderbilt University studied how pregnant women absorbed iron. That sounds harmless enough. Pregnancy increases the body's need for iron, and understanding that process had genuine medical value. The method is where things become uncomfortable. Hundreds of pregnant women were given doses containing radioactive iron-59. Researchers then examined their blood to measure how much iron their bodies absorbed at different stages of pregnancy. Government records later identified 829 women as participants in the research. The women were part of a larger nutrition study, and many were poor patients receiving prenatal care. Later investigations raised serious questions about what they had actually been told and whether meaningful, informed consent had been obtained. To be clear, researchers weren't trying to injure pregnant women. They were trying to answer a legitimate nutritional question using radioactive tracers, a technique that seemed scientifically powerful during the atomic age. But that's exactly what makes this era so unsettling. The 1940s discovered radioactive materials and apparently spent the next few years asking, interesting, what happens if we put this in people? Sometimes medical progress arrived wearing a lab coat. Sometimes it arrived carrying a Geiger counter. 11. The government sprayed bacteria over San Francisco. In September 1950, people in San Francisco went about their normal lives without realizing they had become part of a military experiment. The U.S. Navy released huge quantities of bacteria into the air off the California coast. One organism was Serratia marcescens, chosen partly because scientists believed it was relatively harmless and easy to detect. The idea was to simulate a biological attack and measure how effectively airborne microbes could spread across a major American city. The residents weren't asked, they weren't warned, they simply breathed. Soon afterward, doctors at a local hospital encountered an unusual cluster of Serratia infections. One patient died. Whether the military release directly caused those infections became controversial and was never conclusively established, so it's important not to turn suspicion into fact. But the experiment itself absolutely happened. Military planners wanted to know whether a city could be vulnerable to biological attack, so they secretly released bacteria over an actual city to find out. Apparently, the quickest way to simulate exposing a population was to skip the simulation part. 12. The secret plutonium injections. In 1945, scientists working around the Manhattan Project faced a new problem. Plutonium was incredibly important and dangerously unfamiliar. They needed to understand how it behaved inside the human body, so researchers put it inside human bodies. Between 1945 and 1947, 18 people were injected with plutonium at hospitals around the United States. Researchers collected urine and other samples to determine how quickly the radioactive element left the body. One of the first subjects was Eb Cade, a 53-year-old construction worker hospitalized after a serious automobile accident at Oak Ridge. He was injected with plutonium in April 1945. Another subject, Albert Stevens, was believed to have terminal stomach cancer when he was selected. After his injection, doctors discovered he didn't have cancer at all. He had a benign ulcer. Stevens survived another 20 years. The subjects generally were not told the true nature of the experiments. That secrecy reflected the Manhattan Project itself, where almost everything involving nuclear research was classified. Scientists needed numbers for radiation safety, and 18 unsuspecting patients became part of the calculation. 13. MKUltra. In 1953, the CIA launched MKUltra, a secret program designed to explore ways of influencing human behavior. This wasn't one experiment conducted in one sinister basement. It became a sprawling collection of research projects involving universities, hospitals, prisons, scientists, and front organizations. The CIA investigated hypnosis, sensory manipulation, drugs, and especially LSD. Some participants knew they were involved in research. Others absolutely did not. That distinction turned MKUltra into one of the darkest chapters in American intelligence history. People could be given psychoactive drugs without knowing what they had taken, meaning they had no idea why reality had suddenly stopped behaving normally. Much of the program remained hidden for years, and many MKUltra records were destroyed in 1973. Surviving financial documents were later discovered, helping trigger congressional investigations. In 1977, the U.S. Senate held a major public hearing examining the program and its use of unwitting subjects. The CIA was looking for methods of controlling behavior. Instead, MKUltra became a spectacular demonstration of what happens when secrecy controls the researchers. And somehow, perhaps don't secretly drug people needed a congressional hearing. 14. The psychiatrist who tried to erase personalities. One particularly disturbing branch of MKUltra led to Montreal, Canada, and psychiatrist Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron. Cameron was already a respected figure in psychiatry when he developed a radical treatment he called psychic driving. His patients had come seeking help for conditions such as depression and anxiety. They did not arrive expecting to become subjects in CIA-funded behavioral research. Cameron attempted to break down existing patterns of thought through what he called depatterning. Patients could receive extremely intensive electroconvulsive treatments, drug-induced sleep, and repeated recorded messages played again and again for long periods. LSD was also used in some cases. The CIA secretly helped finance Cameron's research through MKUltra Subproject 68. Surviving records and later investigations confirmed the agency's connection. Some former patients later described devastating memory problems and difficulty functioning after treatment. Cameron believed he might dismantle unhealthy patterns and rebuild healthier personalities. There was just one fairly important engineering problem. Human beings aren't etch-a-sketches. You can't shake away somebody's personality, draw a better one, and congratulate yourself on improving the design. 15. The prisoners deliberately given malaria. The Stateville experiments became even stranger once researchers started testing experimental drugs. After deliberately infecting prisoners with malaria, scientists administered compounds whose side effects were sometimes unpredictable. One experimental drug became so toxic that 3 inmates who received it became seriously ill and suffered dramatic drops in their white blood cell counts. Other trials produced severe stomach pain, weakness, nausea, fainting, and problems related to oxygen-reaching body tissues. The research wasn't pointless. Stateville contributed to the development and evaluation of anti-malarial drugs, including primekine, which became medically important. And many inmates genuinely considered their participation patriotic and worthwhile. But there's a reason the experiments remain controversial. Researchers deliberately created disease in healthy prisoners so they could test treatments against it. Some consent forms acknowledged risks without clearly spelling out exactly what those risks were. Historians also note that prison life complicated the meaning of free consent through money, privileges, status, and the possibility of parole consideration. That makes Stateville one of history's uncomfortable gray zones. The volunteers may have said yes. The harder question is how much freedom existed behind that yes. 16. The Cincinnati radiation experiments. Between 1960 and 1971, doctors at the University of Cincinnati exposed seriously ill cancer patients to whole or partial body radiation. The research had two purposes. Doctors were studying radiation as a possible cancer treatment, while the U.S. Department of Defense also wanted information about how radiation affected human performance, knowledge considered important in the nuclear age. The doses could produce severe nausea, weakness, and changes in blood counts. Many participants were poor, and questions later emerged about whether they truly understood the experimental nature and risks of what they were receiving. Public controversy exploded in 1971 after the military connection became widely known, leading to several investigations of the program. What makes this story complicated is that these were cancer patients receiving radiation that researchers believed might have therapeutic value. It wasn't simply scientists irradiating healthy strangers for fun. But the ethical problem was enormous. Patients deserved to know exactly where treatment ended and experimentation began. During the Cold War, apparently even a hospital bed could become part cancer ward, part nuclear research laboratory. 17. Edgewood Arsenal's chemical experiments. From the 1950s into the 1970s, thousands of U.S. servicemen participated in chemical agent research at Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland. The military wanted to understand how chemical weapons and incapacitating substances affected soldiers, and whether troops could function after exposure. Volunteers encountered an extraordinary range of chemicals. Some experiments involved nerve agents, such as sarin. Others tested psychoactive substances, including LSD and the powerful incapacitating agent BZ. Imagine volunteering for Army research and discovering that today's assignment is basically, we're going to alter your perception of reality, then take notes. The volunteers were not all treated identically, and the level of information provided changed over the long life of the program. Later reviews raised serious concerns about whether participants had always received enough information to give meaningful consent and whether adequate follow-up care was provided. That's the unsettling thing about Cold War research. Scientists weren't necessarily trying to create suffering. They were trying to prepare for weapons they feared an enemy might use. But once national security entered the room, ordinary medical boundaries suddenly became remarkably flexible. The battlefield wasn't overseas anymore. Sometimes it was inside the volunteer. 18. Project Shad put American sailors inside chemical warfare tests. During the 1960s, the U.S. military wanted to know what would happen if an enemy attacked an American warship with chemical or biological weapons. So, it created Project Shad, Shipboard Hazard and Defense. Rather than relying only on laboratory models, the military conducted real tests involving ships and servicemen. SHAD was part of the larger Project 112 program, which ran from 1962 into the early 1970s. Tests involved substances ranging from simulants to actual chemical and biological warfare agents, including nerve agents and disease-causing organisms. Roughly 6,000 American service members were involved in Project 112 and SHAD activities. Much of the program remained classified for decades. Only years later did the Department of Defense begin declassifying information and identifying veterans who might have participated. The VA has since studied their health, although investigations have not established clear evidence of specific long-term illnesses affecting SHAD veterans as a group. That distinction matters. But imagine discovering decades after leaving the Navy that one of your old exercises wasn't just another strange day at sea. You were helping answer the question, what happens when somebody attacks this ship with chemical weapons? 19. The Yellow Fever volunteers. In 1900, yellow fever was killing people while doctors still argued about how the disease spread. U.S. Army physician Walter Reed and his colleagues went to Cuba to test the theory that mosquitoes transmitted it. And testing that theory required human volunteers. Men agreed to be bitten by mosquitoes that had fed on yellow fever patients. Others entered specially constructed rooms containing contaminated clothing and bedding to test the competing idea that infected objects spread the disease. The mosquito experiments helped establish how yellow fever was transmitted, paving the way for mosquito control campaigns that saved countless lives. The danger was very real. More than 30 men participated in the experiments, and 22 developed yellow fever. Remarkably, none of those volunteers died. Later experiments conducted by other researchers were not so fortunate. Nurse Clara Moss died in 1901 after experimental exposure through infected mosquitoes. Here's the surprising part. Reed's team used written consent agreements and offered payment, making the work an important early example in the history of informed consent. Still, picture the recruitment pitch. We think this mosquito carries a deadly disease. Would you mind letting it bite you? Medical research has had easier volunteer drives. 20. Project 112. Turn the environment into a laboratory. Project SHAD was only the shipboard part of something much larger. Beginning in 1962, the Department of Defense ran Project 112, a series of chemical and biological warfare tests conducted in different environments. The purpose was defensive. Military planners wanted to understand how dangerous agents behaved under realistic conditions and how American forces might detect, survive, and respond to an attack. But realistic conditions is where this story becomes uncomfortable. Tests took place on land and at sea and involved American service members. According to the Department of Veterans Affairs, substances used across Project 112 included biological agents associated with Q fever and tularemia, staphylococcal enterotoxin B, and chemical nerve agents including sarin and VX. Other tests used simulants rather than live warfare agents. For years, much of the information remained classified. Veterans sometimes had no detailed public record explaining what had happened around them. Decades later, the government began identifying participants and releasing information. The military wanted the most realistic possible picture of biological warfare. Unfortunately, realism has one annoying requirement. Eventually, somebody has to stand inside the picture. 21. Radioactive milk was served to human volunteers. By 1963, scientists at the Hanford nuclear site in Washington wanted to understand how radioactive iodine moved from the environment into people. So they created a remarkably direct experiment. Researchers fed iodine 131 to dairy cows. 8 Hanford workers then drank milk produced by those cows, either once or across several daily doses. Scientists measured how much radioactive iodine accumulated in the volunteers' thyroid glands, using Hanford's whole-body counting equipment. The amount of stable iodine in the cow's diet was also changed during the study, so researchers could examine how that affected radioactive iodine transfer. The experiment is documented in the Department of Energy's Historical Catalog of Human Radiation Research. Radioactive tracers were widely used in 20th century medicine, and the mere word radioactive doesn't automatically mean participants received catastrophic doses. That distinction is important. Many historical tracer studies involved relatively small exposures, but the scene remains wonderfully unsettling. 8 employees came to work at one of America's major nuclear facilities and helped answer a scientific question by drinking milk from radioactive iodine-fed cows. Most offices experiment with a new coffee machine. Hanford apparently preferred a breakfast menu designed by the atomic age. 22. The Dachau freezing experiments. In 1942, doctors at the Dachau concentration camp began experiments designed to answer a military question. How could German pilots survive after crashing into freezing water? Instead of using models or willing volunteers, researchers used prisoners who had no meaningful ability to refuse. Some victims were immersed in tanks of ice-cold water while doctors monitored how quickly their body temperature dropped. Other experiments exposed prisoners to freezing outdoor conditions. Researchers then tested different methods of warming them again. The goal was supposedly practical, finding better treatments for hypothermia among German airmen, but the methods were brutal and often deadly. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum documents these freezing experiments as part of a larger program at Dachau that also included high-altitude and seawater experiments. Hundreds of prisoners were harmed or killed across the camp's medical research programs. What makes the story especially chilling is the transformation of suffering into measurements: temperature, time, pulse, survival. The researchers wanted to learn how long a human body could survive extreme cold. Their solution was simply to keep freezing human beings until they had an answer. 23. The high-altitude experiments at Dachau flying at extreme altitude presented a serious problem during World War II. If a German pilot had to eject from a damaged aircraft, doctors wanted to know how high a person could be before the lack of oxygen became fatal. At Dachau, researchers decided to find out using prisoners. Beginning in 1942, prisoners were placed inside a low-pressure chamber designed to simulate conditions at extremely high altitudes. German physicians connected to the Luftwaffe and aviation research conducted the experiments. The victims had not volunteered, and some experiments resulted in death. The research was later presented as evidence during the doctor's trial at Nuremberg. There was a legitimate scientific question buried underneath all of this. Pilots really did face decompression and oxygen deprivation, and aviation medicine genuinely needed answers. But legitimate questions do not make criminal methods legitimate. That distinction became enormously important after the war. The atrocities uncovered in concentration camps helped inspire the Nuremberg Code, which placed voluntary consent at the center of ethical human research. Medicine learned something about altitude. Humanity learned something much more important about what scientists should never be allowed to do to obtain the answer. 24. The Ravensbrück wound experiments. At the Ravensbrück concentration camp, German doctors conducted another series of experiments, this time supposedly to investigate battlefield infections and treatments. Prisoners, many of them Polish women, were deliberately wounded. In some experiments, incisions were intentionally contaminated with bacteria and foreign material. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum preserves evidence showing survivors with permanent injuries caused by these procedures. Other prisoners were subjected to bone and muscle operations as researchers investigated regeneration and transplantation. The women selected for some experiments became known among prisoners as the rabbits, a bitter reference to being treated like laboratory animals. The supposed military justification was that German doctors wanted better ways to treat infected wounds suffered by soldiers. But these were not soldiers volunteering for risky research. They were prisoners trapped inside a concentration camp, with no genuine consent and no freedom to walk away. After the war, survivors carried more than testimony. Some carried visible scars that became evidence at the Nuremberg doctor's trial. That may be the most powerful detail of all. The researchers kept records. The survivors brought something harder to explain away: their own bodies. 25. The seawater experiments. Imagine being surrounded by ocean after a plane crash, but unable to drink the water keeping you alive. During World War II, that was a genuine survival problem for pilots and sailors. German researchers wanted a solution. At Dachau, prisoners were used in experiments testing methods of making seawater drinkable. Subjects were placed on severely restricted diets and given different forms of treated seawater. The experiments were part of the broader medical research program designed to solve military survival problems for German forces. Like the freezing and high-altitude experiments, they were conducted on prisoners who could not freely consent. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum lists the seawater research alongside other Dachau experiments carried out for military purposes. The underlying scientific problem was perfectly reasonable. A stranded pilot needed water, and carrying unlimited supplies aboard an aircraft wasn't practical. The method used to investigate that problem was anything but reasonable. That's a recurring pattern in the darkest history of human experimentation. Start with a legitimate question, remove consent, remove accountability, and suddenly another person becomes equipment. The researchers were trying to make the ocean safer for German pilots. To do it, they made a concentration camp even more dangerous for prisoners. 26. The mustard gas experiments on American soldiers. During World War II, the United States feared that enemy forces might use chemical weapons. Military researchers, therefore, needed to test protective clothing, treatments, and equipment against mustard agents. The test subjects were American servicemen. According to the Department of Veterans Affairs, nearly 60,000 military personnel participated in a wide range of mustard agent exposures during the 1940s. Most experienced relatively limited exposure, including patch tests in which small amounts were placed on the skin. But roughly 4,000 soldiers underwent much more severe full-body exposure during field exercises over contaminated areas. Mustard agents can severely damage the skin, eyes, and respiratory system. Some veterans later developed health problems associated with their exposure, and the VA eventually established programs addressing veterans who had participated in the tests. The purpose wasn't pointless cruelty. Military planners feared chemical warfare and wanted equipment capable of protecting troops. But secrecy followed many participants long after the war. Some veterans struggled for years to establish what they had experienced. They volunteered to defend their country. Few probably imagined that one of the threats they would need protection from would come from their own side of the laboratory door. 27. The Nazi malaria experiments. Malaria was a serious military problem during World War II, particularly in regions where mosquitoes could incapacitate enormous numbers of soldiers. At Dachau, German physician Klaus Schilling conducted malaria experiments on concentration camp prisoners. Prisoners were deliberately infected, either through mosquitoes or other methods, and then treated with various drugs in an attempt to study the disease and possible therapies. The experiments involved large numbers of prisoners and caused severe illness. Some victims died from malaria or complications associated with the experimental treatments. These experiments formed part of the broader system of medical abuse at Dachau, where prisoners were treated as research material rather than patients. And there's an important contrast here. Malaria research itself was desperately necessary. Scientists around the world were searching for better treatments because soldiers and civilians were dying from the disease. The horror wasn't the question being asked. It was deciding that certain human beings no longer deserved the right to refuse being used to answer it. After the war, Schilling was tried by an American military court in the Dachau trials and executed in 1946. The mosquitoes transmitted malaria. The researchers supplied the part no insect could provide. Deliberate human cruelty. 28. Josef Mengelé's experiments on twins. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, physician Josef Mengele became infamous for experiments connected to Nazi racial ideology. Twins were of particular interest to him because comparing two genetically similar people appeared to offer a shortcut for studying heredity. The reality was horrifying. Mengele selected twins, including children from arriving prisoners, and subjected them to repeated examinations, measurements, blood collection, and experimental procedures. The research was not designed around modern ethical standards, and the prisoners obviously had no meaningful consent. Some victims died during experiments. Others were murdered so their bodies could be examined afterward. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum identifies Mengele as the most prominent of several Nazi physicians who performed experiments at Auschwitz and notes that many victims were killed to facilitate post-mortem examination. What makes these experiments particularly disturbing is that they weren't simply misguided attempts to treat disease. They were tied directly to Nazi racial ideology. The belief that human beings could be classified, manipulated, and ultimately eliminated according to supposedly biological categories. Mengele wore a doctor's uniform, but medicine is supposed to begin with the patient's humanity. At Auschwitz, that principle had been deliberately removed before the experiment even started. 29. The experiments that helped create the Nuremberg Code. After World War II, the world faced an uncomfortable question. What exactly prevents a doctor from calling cruelty research? At the doctor's trial in Nuremberg, American prosecutors presented evidence of experiments involving freezing, high-altitude, infectious diseases, wounds, sterilization, and other procedures performed on concentration camp prisoners. Several physicians and officials were convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity. But the trial produced something beyond punishment. The judges included 10 principles describing when human experimentation could be considered permissible. Together, those principles became known as the Nuremberg Code. At the top was an idea that sounds obvious today. The voluntary consent of the human subject is essential. The code also emphasized avoiding unnecessary suffering, having scientifically justified experiments, and allowing subjects to end their participation. That is what makes this final part so haunting. Humanity didn't write these rules because philosophers gathered around a table and imagined everything that might go wrong. The rules were written after people had already done those things. Sometimes civilization creates safeguards before disaster, and sometimes it creates them while staring directly at the evidence of what happens when there are none. 30. Prisoners had their testicles irradiated. Between 1963 and 1973, researchers in Oregon and Washington used prisoners to study one particularly uncomfortable question. How much radiation could human testicles receive before sperm production was damaged? A total of 131 prisoners participated in the experiments. Researchers exposed their testicles to controlled doses of X-rays, then monitored changes in sperm production and recovery. The work received funding from the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission and had no therapeutic benefit for the prisoners themselves. Scientists wanted information useful for understanding radiation risks faced by workers, soldiers, and potentially astronauts. The prisoners volunteered and signed consent documents. But later investigations questioned whether they had been adequately informed about all the possible risks, including uncertainty surrounding genetic effects. The experiments eventually became part of the federal government's major review of Cold War human radiation research. And once again, prison research created the same uncomfortable problem. A signature tells you somebody agreed. It doesn't automatically tell you whether the choice was truly free. When your laboratory subjects live behind locked doors and have almost no opportunities to earn money, volunteer becomes a surprisingly complicated scientific term. They were created because researchers had already demonstrated it. 35 experiments, decades of excuses, and one uncomfortable lesson. Progress without ethics can become something terrifying. Which case shocked you most? Tell me in the comments, and subscribe, because history still has plenty of locked laboratory doors left to open.